Malcolm Reed lost his job at 10:17 on a Tuesday morning in a room with no windows and fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency slightly too high to ignore, across a laminate table, from a woman who had practiced the words often enough that they no longer required her to feel them. Paula Kent, the human resources manager at Eastbridge Logistics, had been doing this particular kind of meeting for 11 years. She had developed, over those years, a style of delivery that was meant to be compassionate and was instead precise, in the way that a surgical instrument is precise, clean, efficient, and indifferent to the specific tissue it was cutting through. She used phrases that had been assembled, probably in a training somewhere, to distribute the impact of what was being said across language that carried as little of it as possible. Position eliminated. Restructuring initiative. Grateful for your contributions. We wish you success. Malcolm listened to all of it. He had been working at Eastbridge Logistics for 11 years and 9 months. He had started as a freight handler on the loading dock and worked his way to team lead on the overnight processing line, which meant he arrived before his crew and left after them and was accountable for the throughput numbers and the safety record. And the temperature in the warehouse, where the HVAC system had never quite worked properly. He knew every person who worked his line by name, knew which of them had children in daycare, and which were taking night classes, and which had mothers in assisted living facilities, and which were the ones you could ask to cover an extra shift, and which were the ones you couldn't, not because they were unreliable, but because they were already stretched to the edge of what a person can reasonably hold without breaking. He had been one of those people for 4 years now, since Denise died. Denise had been 41 years old, and had been diagnosed with a late-stage cancer that moved faster than any of the treatment timelines suggested it would. She had died on a Thursday morning in April, in a hospital room, where someone had put a small vase of flowers on the windowsill, and the flowers had been there so long, they were starting to drop petals. Malcolm had been holding her hand. Jonah had been asleep on the chair in the corner. He was 16 at the time, and he had asked the night before if he should go home. And Malcolm had said no, stay, which had been the right decision, because by morning there was nothing left to go home for. The grief had operated in Malcolm the way grief operates in practical people, not as paralysis but as added weight. He got up. He made breakfast. He drove Jonah to school and picked him up. He went to work and managed his crew with the same thoroughness and steadiness that had always characterized his work, and he absorbed the extra difficulty of living without the person who had made every other difficulty manageable, and he did not talk about it to anyone, except occasionally to Jonah, which they both understood was a form of mutual support with the pretense, for each other's benefit, that neither of them needed it. Jonah was now 20 years old. He had enrolled in a social work program at the community college, and was working part-time at the public library 2 evenings a week, and on Saturday mornings. He was the kind of young man who did not require managing, which was its own form of generosity from a child to a parent. He had told Malcolm twice in the past year that he didn't have to handle everything alone. Malcolm had heard him both times and been unable entirely to act on the instruction. The envelope Paula Kent slid across the table contained 2 weeks of severance, a COBRA notification, and a sheet of paper with 3 bullet points about career transition resources. Malcolm looked at each item. He set them back in the envelope. He asked if he had done anything wrong. Paula said no. He asked if his performance record had any documented deficiencies. She said it did not. He asked what criterion had been used to determine which positions were eliminated. She said the company was restructuring toward a more flexible staffing model, which meant, to anyone who understood the language, that they were replacing people with stable employment arrangements and accumulated benefits and tenure-based pay scales with workers hired through a temp agency who could be added and removed without triggering the obligations that came with direct employment. Malcolm thanked her, which was genuine and strange, and something he did not fully understand as he did it. He picked up the box his belongings had been placed in before he arrived. They had known he was not coming back to his station, had boxed it for him, which was either a kindness or an efficiency, and he could not determine which, and he walked out through the loading dock he had managed for 4 years, past the bay doors he knew by their sounds, down the ramp where the concrete had a chip on the left edge that he had reported 3 times to maintenance. Darius Hill caught up to him in the parking lot. Darius had worked the line with Malcolm for 7 years and had been let go the same morning. He was angrier than Malcolm in the visible, immediate way, voice elevated, hands moving, and the anger was legitimate in every particular. He said the company had been recruiting through a temp agency for months, had been building the replacement workforce without telling anyone, had let the people who had kept the operation running through a pandemic and 2 ice storms and a period of supply chain disruption that had required Malcolm's team to work 80-hour weeks just to stay on schedule. Had let those people believe they were stable and then eliminated them in a morning. Malcolm did not argue with any of this. He agreed with it. He also said, "We need more than anger. We need what actually happened." Darius said he was willing to find what actually happened. Malcolm said he would too. But that was later. Right now there was the parking lot and the cardboard box, and the fact that his account balance, when he checked it on his phone, showed a number that made his breathing shallow for a moment before he steadied it. $18.47. The next paycheck would not come, because there would not be a next paycheck. The severance was 2 weeks. The COBRA was expensive, in the way that health insurance is expensive when you are paying for it yourself, which was not optional, because Jonah was still on his plan. He had a savings account that had a number in it that was more reassuring than the checking account, but less reassuring than the monthly expenses it would need to cover. He ran the calculation the way he ran most calculations, quickly, without wanting to, and with a result that was accurate and unpleasant. He drove away from Eastbridge Logistics. He did not go straight home. He drove through the streets of the neighborhood, between the warehouse and his apartment, and he thought about Jonah at the kitchen table with his social work textbooks. He thought about the look on Jonah's face, which would be one of concern concealed inside composure, because Jonah had learned composure from watching his father, and had learned concern from loving him. He thought about the conversation he was going to have when he walked through the door, and he thought about how he wanted that conversation to go, which was, carefully, truthfully, without making Jonah feel that he had to absorb more fear than the situation required. He stopped in front of a restaurant he and Denise had gone to sometimes on Thursday evenings. It was not a special restaurant. It served the kind of food that was not trying to be anything other than what it was. Chicken, properly seasoned, with mashed potatoes that were made from actual potatoes, and cornbread that came out of the oven while you were eating. The meal for 2, the better part of what he had in his account. He knew this when he walked in. He ordered it anyway. He believed, going in, that there was value in having a good meal before a hard conversation. He believed that the environment in which a difficult thing was said shaped how it was heard, and that a decent dinner was a form of care that he could still offer his son on a day when most of what he had planned to offer had been taken away. He was carrying the food in a bag when he cut through the park near the bus stop. The park was a narrow strip of green between 2 blocks that had once been a slightly more vibrant part of the city and had settled into a quieter version of itself with the usual elements: a few benches, a path, a corner where someone had planted rose bushes that had never fully stopped blooming, despite nobody particularly maintaining them. At this hour the park held the post-lunch passage of office workers heading back from nearby sandwich places, the occasional parent with a stroller, the ambient movement of a city going about its afternoon, and on one of the benches, in a coat that had a tear at the left elbow, and shoes that had absorbed enough weather to have changed color, was an old woman. She was sitting in the specific dick posture of someone who has been still for a long time, not the relaxed stillness of someone at rest, but the conserved stillness of someone managing cold. Her hands were wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone from hot to lukewarm to whatever it was now, and she held it with both hands, less because she was drinking it than because the heat, what remained of it, was the best available option. People were passing her, not ignoring her, exactly. There is a specific art to the way people in cities fail to see what they have decided not to engage with, and it is its own form of attention, an active not seeing that requires as much intention as looking would. A woman in a good coat adjusted her path slightly as she passed. Two men in ties were having a phone conversation and moved around the bench without interrupting it. A security guard from the building across the street had come out a few minutes earlier, had said something to the woman that she had apparently responded to with sufficient compliance that he had gone back inside, though his manner, as he went, suggested he would be out again. Malcolm walked past the bench. He had gone 4 steps before he stopped. He stood there for a moment. He thought about Denise in those last months, when she had been very ill and had moved through the world in a way that required accommodation from it. Not her request, not her preference, just the physical fact of her condition, which some people met with the particular gentleness that genuine compassion produces, and others met with the particular management that discomfort about suffering produces. He remembered the ones who had met it the second way, and he remembered what it had felt like to watch someone he loved be processed rather than seen. He turned around. He sat down on the bench beside the woman. He opened the bag. "It's cold," he said. "Come eat with me for a minute." She looked at him. She had the eyes of a person who has spent a long day recalibrating their expectations of the world and entirely sure what to do with an exception. He divided the food. He gave her the larger half. He handed her the cornbread. He poured some of the coffee from the paper cup he had gotten with the meal into the lid and set it near her. "You have enough?" she said. "Not really," he said. "But you need it more today." They ate in the particular silence that happens between people who do not know each other well enough to make conversation, but are comfortable enough, for reasons neither can fully explain, to share a bench and a meal without needing to. The city moved around them. The security guard did not come back out. She told him her name was Eleanor. He told her his name was Malcolm. She asked what had brought him here in the middle of the afternoon on a weekday. He told her. He told her plainly, without self-pity, with the same level accuracy he used for most things, that he had been let go that morning after almost 12 years, that he had a son at home who didn't yet know, that he had bought dinner with the last meaningful money in his account, because he wanted to have a good meal with his son before a hard conversation. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Why did you stop?" she said. He thought about it. "My wife was sick for a long time before she died," he said. "A lot of people looked right through her, not mean about it. Just they had somewhere else to look." He was quiet for a moment. "I can't be one of those people, even when things are bad. Maybe especially when things are bad." He looked at the rose bushes at the corner of the park, still holding their last flowers. "My mother used to say that the moment when you have the least to give is when giving costs the most and means the most. I don't know if it means anything to you, but I can't walk past that bench." Eleanor said nothing for a while. He did not know what he had hit. He did not know that the woman sitting beside him on a park bench in a torn coat was Eleanor Whitmore, who was the founder and controlling shareholder of Whitmore Holdings, a holding company whose portfolio included Eastbridge Logistics, among 23 other commercial enterprises. He did not know that she had spent the morning dressed deliberately in clothing she had selected for their worn quality, moving through a part of the city whose character had been substantially shaped by decisions made in her conference rooms, absorbing what it felt like to be one of the people those decisions were made about, rather than one of the people making them. She had done this because the board was scheduled to vote in 10 days on a proposal put forward by the chief financial officer to implement what the proposal called an operational efficiency restructuring across all distribution and logistics subsidiaries. The proposal would, in practice, eliminate approximately 850 full-time positions across several warehouses and replace them with contracted labor through an agency. It would improve the short-term earnings figures. It was designed to improve the short-term earnings figures. Beyond the short term, it would do what this kind of substitution almost always did: degrade service quality, increase turnover, reduce institutional knowledge, and shift risk onto workers who had no protection against it. Eleanor had been going to approve it. She had been going to approve it because the CFO, Graham Voss, was very good at presenting numbers in the way that made approval feel like rationality, and because she had been inside her own buildings and her own boardrooms for long enough that the distance between those rooms and the people whose lives the decisions affected had grown wide enough that she had stopped feeling it as a distance. She had decided to feel it for one day. She had not expected that the one person to sit beside her would be a man who had just been processed through one of her efficiency decisions, carrying food he had bought with what appeared to be his last meaningful money, who had stopped because he could not walk past someone who needed company. When Malcolm finished eating, he put what remained of the food in the bag. He reached into his pocket. He had $3 and some change. He put it on the bench beside her. "Find somewhere warm," he said. He picked up the bag. He said goodbye. He walked home to talk to his son. He did not know that Eleanor Whitmore sat on that bench for another 20 minutes after he left, in the gathering cold of the afternoon, with $3 and some change in her hand, and a decision she had been building toward for months that was now, suddenly, no longer comfortable to make. Her assistant, Lydia Shaw, found her there at 4 o'clock. Lydia was alarmed, as she often was when Eleanor did things that were unconventional and potentially risky, and she was relieved, as she always was, that Eleanor was fine. She had a car nearby. She helped Eleanor to it. On the drive back to the hotel where Eleanor was staying, Lydia asked if she had what she needed from the day. Eleanor said, "Find me the file on Eastbridge Logistics. The full personnel file, not the summary." She also said, "And find out who Malcolm Reed is." It took Lydia less than 2 hours. Malcolm Reed, former team lead at Eastbridge Logistics, 11 years and 9 months of employment. Performance record, above average throughout, excellent in the most recent review cycle. Safety record, clean, with 2 commendations, one for identifying a loading dock hazard before it caused an injury, and one for managing a difficult personnel situation that had resolved without HR escalation. Attendance record, 4 absences in nearly 12 years, all documented as family medical. Reason for termination, position eliminated as part of an efficiency restructuring initiative. Eleanor read this file 3 times. She read the broader termination list. She cross-referenced it with the compensation data. The pattern was clear once you were looking for it. The people selected for elimination were disproportionately from the higher end of the wage scale. Not because they were paid extravagantly, but because they had been there long enough to accumulate years of incremental raises, because they had benefits that full-time tenure produced, because they were, in the language that Graham Voss had used in the presentation, higher cost per unit of labor. The people brought in to replace them would cost less per hour, because they would have no tenure, no benefits, no stability, and no reason to develop the institutional knowledge that Malcolm Reed and Darius Hill and the others had spent a decade accumulating. Eleanor called Lydia back. She said, "I need to meet Malcolm Reed," she said, "and I need to see the proposal from Graham Voss again, this time with a different set of questions." The questions she arrived at the proposal with, 2 days later, were not the ones Graham had prepared for. Malcolm, in those 2 days, had been doing what he had told Darius he would do, looking for what actually happened. Darius had connections at the warehouse, people who were still inside, who owed him information if not loyalty, and through those connections they had established a picture of the restructuring that was more complete than what Paula Kent's prepared language had conveyed. The temp agency that Eastbridge was contracting with was not, as far as either of them could determine, a company with significant operational history. It was new. It had one major client. That client was Eastbridge Logistics. When Malcolm received a call from a woman identifying herself as a representative of Whitmore Holdings Community Operations Division, asking if he would be willing to meet, he did not immediately understand what he was being asked. He called Darius, who looked up Whitmore Holdings, and then Darius called him back and told him what Whitmore Holdings was. Malcolm sat at the kitchen table for a while. Jonah came home from the library. "You have a weird expression," Jonah said. "I've been invited to meet the CEO of the company that owns Eastbridge Logistics." Jonah sat down. "Why? I don't know yet," Malcolm said. "But I think it has something to do with a bench." He wore his best shirt to the meeting. It was not a particularly impressive shirt by any objective standard, but it was clean, and it fit well, and he had ironed it the night before, and the effort of preparation was its own form of self-respect, distinct from any expectation of what the meeting would produce. He was shown into a conference room in a building downtown that had the specific air of a place where significant decisions were made. The room was warm. There was water on the table. Eleanor Whitmore walked in. She was wearing a business suit, the color of dark charcoal. Her hair was silver and cut short. She looked nothing like the woman on the bench, except for something in the eyes that Malcolm recognized before any other recognition arrived. He went very still. She said, "You know," he said, "I'm starting to." She sat down across from him and told him everything, in the precise, unflinching way of someone who has decided that the least she can do is be direct. The disguise, the reason for it, the day in the park, his name on the termination list, what the file said about his record, what the proposal said about the rationale. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Is this the part where you offer me my job back?" "No," she said. "This is the part where I ask you to help me understand what I've been missing, because I think I've been missing it for a long time, and I think you're the person who can tell me what it looks like from inside." He thought about that. "I'm not a consultant," he said. "I'm not hiring a consultant." He thought about Darius in the parking lot. He thought about the people on his line, the woman with the daughter in daycare, the man taking night classes, the woman whose mother was in assisted living. He thought about them receiving the same envelope he had received, in the same fluorescent room, from someone reading from the same prepared language. "I'll talk to you," he said. "But I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. I'm going to tell you what is true. That's all I need," she said. The conversation lasted 3.5 hours. That first meeting and spanned 2 subsequent meetings over the following week. Malcolm talked about the warehouse in the way that only someone who has spent a decade inside a place can talk about it, not in the abstract, but in the specific, the particular dynamics of a team that trusts each other versus one that is reassembled every few months. The institutional knowledge that lived in the experienced workers, the knowledge of which doctor tended to misalign in cold weather, which vendor always ran late on Tuesdays, which approach to a specific client's order specifications saved an hour per shift. And the fact that this knowledge did not exist in a manual or a database, but in the habits and memory of people who could not be replaced by a lower rate per hour, without replacing the knowledge as well. He talked about safety, about the relationship between tenure and accident rates, about the specific circumstances of 3 incidents at Eastbridge over the past 5 years that had been averted, because experienced workers had recognized developing problems before they became accidents, and about the reality that the workers who would replace them would not have that recognition, not because they were inferior people, but because the recognition was the product of years that the temp model did not provide. He talked about Jonah. He talked about the families on his line. He talked about the $18.47 in his account at 10:17 on a Tuesday morning, and what that number meant, not as a character detail but as a data point, about the downstream consequence of a decision made in a room where no one had to look at the number. Darius Hill provided evidence of his own email records, internal communications, the operating history of the temp agency that had been established as Eastbridge's replacement workforce. What those records showed, once assembled in order, was that the agency had been created with a purpose to provide Eastbridge with a mechanism for the restructuring it was planning, and that Graham Voss had known about it, had facilitated it, and had structured the efficiency proposal around it in a way that would not have disclosed this relationship in normal board review. Eleanor presented the evidence to her legal team. Graham Voss was suspended pending investigation. The board meeting on the efficiency proposal was postponed. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor began a process that she described in a board communication, a strategic alignment review of compensation and employment practices across all Whitmore Holdings subsidiaries. The communication used more institutional language than this description implies. What it meant in practice was that someone with the authority to ask the questions was finally asking them. Malcolm was offered a formal position, Director of Worker Experience and Operations Integrity for Whitmore Holdings distribution subsidiaries. The title was long, but the role was concrete. He would be in the warehouses, talking to the people who worked them, reporting to the board directly, with the specific mandate to surface what the efficiency reports did not surface. He went home and talked to Jonah. He told him everything, all of it, the morning at the warehouse and the bench, and the woman in the torn coat, and the meetings in the conference room, and the offer that was now on the table. Jonah listened. He was quiet for a moment. "Dad," he said, "you gave away our dinner on the day you lost your job. I know. You couldn't walk past someone who needed company. I know." Jonah looked at the table. "She was the person your decision landed on," he said slowly. "Like your decision to share, it landed on the person whose decision had landed on you." Malcolm had thought about this several times since Eleanor had told him. It was the kind of thing that resisted a clean interpretation. It was not poetic justice exactly, and it was not coincidence in any meaningful sense, and it was not a lesson delivered by a universe that was paying attention, because the universe was not paying attention. It was just a thing that had happened. Two people on a bench in the ordinary accident of an ordinary afternoon, and the difference was what each of them had chosen to do about it. "I think the point," Malcolm said, "is just that it happened, and what we do with it from here." He accepted the position. He went back to the warehouse on his first official day in his new role and did the thing that the role required. He walked the floor, and he talked to people, and he listened. He talked to the woman with the daughter in daycare. He talked to the man taking night classes. He got the woman, whose mother was in assisted living, the information she needed about the Family Assistance Fund that Whitmore Holdings had allowed to go unfunded for 3 years. He did none of this from an office. He did it from the floor, from the loading dock, from the break room at the end of a shift, when people were tired enough to be honest. And slowly, over months, the picture he assembled and brought to the board's attention was the picture of a company that had been making decisions as if the people inside its buildings were interchangeable components, rather than the accumulated knowledge and trust and capacity that held the operation together. It was not a revolutionary picture. It was not a secret that anyone had been keeping from malice. It was the picture that becomes visible when the person in the room has spent enough time on the floor to see it, and when the person with the authority to act on it is finally paying attention. The park near the bus stop still had the rose bushes at the corner. Malcolm walked past it sometimes, on the way to or from the warehouse district, and occasionally he stopped for a moment, not to sit, just to look at the flowers that nobody maintained, and that bloomed anyway. He thought about his mother, who had said that when you have the least to give, giving costs the most and means the most. He thought about $18.47. He thought about Jonah asking, "You gave away our dinner on the day you lost your job." He had not done it to be noble. He had not done it because he believed it would produce anything. He had done it because he looked at a person on a bench, and saw a person on a bench, and that was the only reason that had ever been required. And perhaps that was the most honest thing he could say about the months that followed. That the outcome was large, but the origin was small. That the thing that changed the direction of a company and restored the livelihoods of hundreds of people and reminded a woman who had been powerful for so long that she had forgotten what power felt like from outside. That all of it began with a man who had nothing to spare, making the decision, without calculation, to share what he had, because he could not walk past a person who needed company, because that was the kind of man he was. Because when you have the least to give is precisely when giving matters the most. That was the thing his mother had told him. He had remembered it on the worst morning of a very difficult year, and it had turned out to be true.